In that ancient Mediterranean culture in which Jesus lived, when someone would ask a question, it was rarely to request information. There was a hidden agenda. When someone would ask a question in that culture, they almost always viewed it with suspicion and a challenge to another person's personal honor. The hope is that the person the question has been asked will not know the answer, and they will become shamed by their own ignorance. Now, lest we miss this point, Luke explicitly states that the scholar of the law, a lawyer, his intent was testing Jesus. Jesus is about to do something he does so masterfully to his questioner, something he does throughout the gospel consistently when being challenged. He insults the lawyer. Not once, but 3 times. He asked him about the law when he was questioned. Well, Jesus said, well, how do you read the law? How do you interpret it? So the lawyer was quick with an answer, and he answered correctly, quoting Deuteronomy and Leviticus, thereby revealing that he knew the answer all along. His question was not simply a test for Jesus, it was a lie. He pretended to be ignorant, and he wasn't. Instead of shaming Jesus, however, the lawyer shames himself. And Jesus emerges once again the honorable victor in the contest. Now the lawyer has one more chance to save face, or as the gospel reads, to justify himself. So he asks Jesus another question. Who is my neighbor? Jesus recognizes this question as yet another lie. Because after all, the content of Leviticus, to which the lawyer had just quoted correctly, it explicitly notes that neighbor is your kin, your people. So why would he ask such a question? The lawyer is now told 2 lies. One to cause trouble for Jesus, and another to salvage his own sinking reputation. Jesus' masterfully crafted parable of the Good Samaritan is soon to lay the final lash of shame on the humbled back of this very arrogant lawyer. From the book, The Cultural World of Jesus, Dr. John Pilch offers 7 points to consider when we are reading about the Good Samaritan within that cultural context. And I'm going to share these 7 points. Point number 1. The robbers stripped and leave the victim half dead. Now, no one can identify the victim's ethnicity by his garments or his accent. 2 very common ways of identifying a stranger in that culture. So in other words, to help this guy was taking a big risk. Point number 2. The priest, riding a donkey in accord with his very elite status, notices the victim and just ponders. If the victim is dead or non-Judean, the priest would be defiled by touching him, and then would have to return to Jerusalem for purification. Those who just saw him gloriously fulfilling his priestly role in Jerusalem would now see him returning in shame for purification. The risk is just too great for this holy priest. Number 3. The Levite may have come closer to examine the victim, and even though the road may not have been straight, the Levite very likely saw the priest's response to the victim from afar. And if the priest did not give him first aid, well, why should the Levite? Another way of looking at that would be, if the Levite gave him first aid, that could be a challenge to the priest, an insult to the priest. So moreover, if the victim was one of those who lived in Samaria, why should I help him? He's not equal to the Levite. He's his enemy. Point number 4, the Samaritan. The Samaritan is a shocking third character to the story. Jesus' listeners would have probably expected a Jewish layperson to help this victim. But this hated enemy is reaching down with compassion to help him. Number 5, the Samaritan offers first aid, wine, oil, bandages, which the Levite could have done but neglected to do. The Samaritan risked that if the victim might hate him, the victim could hate him if he regains consciousness, because the Samaritan wine and oil were considered impure and would make the Judean victim impure as well. It's sort of in a certain sense, the Samaritan in this storyline is sort of darned if you do and darned if you don't. Number 6, the Samaritan then does what the priest should have done, but didn't. He places the victim on his own animal, takes him to the inn, and he continues to care for him. And number 7, finally, the Samaritan, in contrast to the robbers, promises to come back and pay any additional expenses. Now, this is the most foolish part of the story. You see, the victim, if the victim would die, his family, because they couldn't find the robbers, would probably kill the benefactor. So why would he come back? Or if the victim survives, he may rage against the Samaritan for making him impure. Remember, he used Samaritan oil and wine. The thrust of the parable is not lost on our lawyer, that scholar of the law. His face is still red with shame from Jesus' earlier insults. Now Jesus thrusts the final shaming question. Which of these 3 became neighbor to the victim? The astute lawyer immediately recognizes this new impending shame. The question the lawyer, remember, asked Jesus was, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus questions him a little differently. To whom must you become neighbor? The lawyer realizes that one must become neighbor to anyone and everyone in need. One must reach out with compassion to all people, even if it's our enemy. Too often this parable has been read as a pleasant moral lesson of kindness or neighborliness. But now we know the backstory of this ancient Mediterranean culture, what gives it a fresh new look. A hated outsider extends compassion and love to an enemy. What a risk for the Samaritan. And what a lesson for you and I. So the question for us today, who's your neighbor? Who might you put your arms around, even at the risk of being looked down upon because you show compassion to someone in need? In our Western culture, we are quick to profile people, aren't we? We're quick to divide in classes, black and white, or separate ourselves from those who we fear to touch. We're quick to say that she's unmarried and pregnant. You know he's gay. They're impure because, after all, they are divorced. However we profile, whenever we profile, we miss the point, and in the end, shame will come back on us, just like it did to the scholar of the law. So using Jesus' question, he addressed to the scholar, and he addresses to each one of us. Which of the 3 became neighbor to the victim? Or maybe said another way, which of us will become neighbor to the discriminated? Which of us will become neighbor to the marginalized? Which of us will become neighbor to the outcast? Or whomever is victim of being profiled? The answer? The one who treats others with mercy and compassion. Then we will hear Jesus in his final statement. Then go and do likewise.